The first thing I noticed about the tower was how much it swayed. Not dramatically, not in any way that felt dangerous, but enough that when I set a cup of water on the desk that first afternoon, I could see the surface trembling. A faint, continuous vibration, like the whole structure was breathing. The ranger who drove me in, a woman named Carla with sun-damaged skin and a voice that sounded like she'd been awake for several days, told me that was normal. She said the tower was built to give. That was the word she used. Give. The bolts and crossbeams were designed with enough flex to handle wind loads up to 70 miles per hour. Anything above that, she said, and I should get below the catwalk and radio in. She didn't say what would happen at that point. I didn't ask. The drive had taken just under 4 hours from the district office in Winthrop, the last 2 on unpaved Forest Service roads that narrowed steadily until we were pushing through brush on both sides. Carla didn't talk much. She pointed out a few landmarks as we climbed an elevation. A creek crossing that could flood in late spring. A wide meadow where they'd staged a burnout operation 2 summers ago. The charred trunks were still standing, pale and stripped, scattered through the new growth like old teeth. I watched them pass and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not sadness. Something closer to the feeling of entering a room where a conversation has just stopped. The tower itself sat at the top of a rocky ridge, maybe 50 feet of steel lattice bolted to a concrete pad, with a 14 by 14-foot cab on top. Glass on all 4 sides. A narrow catwalk wrapped around the outside. Inside there was a cot, a desk, a propane stove, a fire finder mounted on a pedestal in the center of the room, and a radio bolted to the wall beside the north-facing window. The fire finder was an Osborne, the old circular kind with a sighting ring and a map underneath the glass. It was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. The brass was dull, but still precise, and when I turned the ring, it moved with a smoothness that suggested decades of careful use. Carla walked me through the equipment, radio protocol, frequency assignments, the daily weather observation schedule. She showed me how to read the psychrometer and the wind gauge mounted on the roof, how to fill out the 10-day log sheets where the backup batteries were stored. She was thorough, but not patient. She had the manner of someone who had explained these things many times and was no longer interested in whether the explanation landed. I nodded and took notes in a small book I'd brought, and she watched me write with an expression I couldn't read. Before she left, she handed me the handbook. It was a Forest Service publication, maybe 40 pages, with a green cover that had faded to the color of old sage. The corners were soft and round from handling. Inside, someone had highlighted sections on fire behavior and smoke color identification, and there were margin notes in at least 3 different handwritings. One person had drawn small diagrams of cloud formations. Another had written phone numbers that were no longer in service. I flipped through it while Carla loaded her gear back into the truck. That's when I found the line. It was on the inside of the back cover, written in pencil, faint but legible. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind of printing you'd see from someone used to filling out forms. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. No date, no initials, no context. Just that one sentence, sitting alone on the inside of the cover, like it had always been there. I brought it to Carla. I held the book open and showed her, and she looked at it for a moment with no change in expression. She said that previous lookouts sometimes left notes. She said some people didn't do well with the isolation and that the handbook accumulated things over the years. She didn't say the note was a joke, and she didn't say it was serious. She closed the tailgate of the truck and told me my first weather observation was due at 1300, which gave me about 2 hours to settle in. Then she drove away, and the sound of the engine faded down the ridge, and I was alone. I stood on the catwalk for a while after she left. The view was extraordinary, the kind of thing you see in photographs but never quite trust until you're standing inside it. The forest spread in every direction, a vast unbroken canopy of Douglas fir and western red cedar and hemlock, dark green and dense, filling the valleys and climbing the opposite ridges until it thinned near the higher elevations where rock and alpine meadow took over. To the south, I could see a chain of peaks still holding snow. To the north and east, just trees, miles of them. The canopy had a texture from this distance, a kind of roughness, like the surface of a deep green ocean, frozen mid-swell. I could see the wind moving through it in long, slow waves, patches of lighter color where the branches turned and showed their undersides, rolling across the treetops like something passing underneath. I went inside and unpacked my things. I'd brought more books than clothes, which felt like a mistake almost immediately, because the shelf space was limited and the cot took up most of one wall. I arranged what I could and stowed the rest in a duffel under the desk. I made coffee on the propane stove and sat in the chair by the fire finder and looked out the windows and tried to understand what I had agreed to. 12 weeks. That was the contract. Mid-June through early September, the fire season in the North Cascades. I had taken the job for reasons that seemed clear at the time, but were already becoming difficult to articulate. I had left a teaching position in Bellingham. I had ended a relationship that had lasted longer than it should have. I wanted quiet, and I wanted distance, and I wanted a task that was simple and defined. Watch for fire. Report what you see. There was an appealing clarity to it. The job was entirely about observation. You sat in a glass room above the world, and you looked, and if you saw something that mattered, you picked up the radio and said so. That was the whole thing. My first weather observation went fine. Temperature, 61 degrees. Relative humidity, 44%. Wind out of the southwest at 8 miles per hour, gusting to 12. Cloud cover scattered, cumulus, base at maybe 8,000 feet. I read the instruments, filled in the form, and radioed the numbers to dispatch. A man's voice acknowledged with a call sign and read back my figures, and that was it. The entire exchange took less than a minute. I set the form on the desk and looked at the clock and realized I had 11 hours and 47 minutes until the next one. That first week was an education in time. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that I had never before understood how long an hour actually was. In my previous life, time had been structured by other people, by classes and meetings and meals and obligations that divided the day into segments that passed without my noticing. Here, time was raw material. It accumulated. I would scan the horizon, check the fire finder, look at my watch, and discover that 4 minutes had passed. I would read a chapter of a book, feel certain that an hour had gone by, and find that it had been 20 minutes. The days were 16 hours long, and every one of those hours had to be filled with something, and there was almost nothing to fill them with. I developed routines quickly, out of necessity. Morning weather observation at 0600, coffee and breakfast, a full scan of the horizon using the fire finder, starting north and rotating clockwise, noting anything that might be smoke or haze. Mid-morning radio check. A walk around the catwalk to inspect the equipment, the anemometer, the rain gauge, the solar panel that charged the backup battery. Lunch. Afternoon observation at 1300. Another full scan. Reading. Evening observation at 1800. Dinner. The long, slow twilight, which at this latitude in late June lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, the sky going through shades of orange and violet that I initially found stunning and eventually found routine, which itself was a kind of loss I tried not to think about. The nights were different. After dark, there was nothing to observe. The forest became a black absence below me, a vast space defined only by the absence of stars along the horizon. I could hear it, though. The wind in the canopy made a sound like distant water, a continuous, layered rushing that rose and fell without ever stopping entirely. On still nights, I could hear individual trees, the creak of wood under stress, the dry rattle of dead branches shifting, occasionally something else, a crack or a thump that could have been a falling limb or a large animal moving through brush. I would lie on the cot and listen, and the sounds would weave together into something almost like music, and I would sleep. I thought about the note in the handbook a few times during that first week, but not seriously. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. It read like the kind of thing a bored person writes when they've been alone too long. The trees were always moving. That was one of the first things I'd learned. The wind was nearly constant at this elevation, and the canopy responded to it in ways that were endlessly varied. Gusts would sweep across the ridges, and the trees would bow and recover, and the motion would propagate through the forest in visible waves. It was one of the few things that never became boring. I could watch the wind move through the trees for 20 minutes and still find it interesting. So the idea that the trees might start moving was, as a premise, almost meaningless. They never stopped. Unless the note meant something else. Unless moving meant something specific that I hadn't yet learned to recognize. I let that thought go. It was easy to do in those first days. The job was new enough that the routines still required attention, and the solitude hadn't yet shifted from chosen to imposed. I was still in the phase where being alone felt like freedom. The second week, I started keeping a personal journal alongside the official logs. I don't know exactly why. I think I wanted a record that was mine, separate from the weather data and the fire reports, something that captured what it actually felt like to be here, rather than just the measurable conditions. I wrote about the light mostly. The way it changed through the day, how the forest looked different at 7 in the morning than at 7 in the evening, even though the sun was at the same angle, just mirrored. I wrote about the birds. Steller's jays were the most common visitors to the tower, bold and loud, landing on the catwalk railing to watch me through the glass with that peculiar, tilted focus that birds have. Clark's nutcrackers higher up, near the tree line, hawks circling in the thermals that rose off the south-facing slopes in the afternoon. I also wrote about the tree line, not because anything was wrong with it, but because it was the dominant feature of my visual world, and I was trying to find language for it. The nearest trees were maybe 200 yards from the base of the tower, where the ridge dropped off and the forest began. From the cab, looking down and out, the canopy appeared as a continuous surface, dark and textured, broken only by occasional snags, dead trees still standing, their bare trunks and branches jutting above the green like bones. The tree line was sharpest to the west, where a natural meadow created a clear boundary between grass and forest. I used that meadow as a reference point during my scans. It was shaped roughly like a stretched oval, maybe 300 yards long and 80 yards wide at its broadest point, and the trees along its western edge formed a remarkably straight line, as if they had been planted to a surveyor's mark. I noted that line in my journal on June 19th. I described it as unusually regular. I wrote that it looked almost artificial. Then I made my 1300 observation, radioed it in, and read for the rest of the afternoon. On June 22nd, I had my first real conversation over the radio. Not a weather report, not a check-in, but an actual exchange. A lookout named Davis, stationed at a tower I couldn't see, maybe 30 miles to the southeast, called on the mutual aid frequency one evening and asked if anyone was awake. I answered, and we talked for about 40 minutes. He'd been doing this for 3 seasons. He told me about a fire he'd spotted the previous summer, how he'd watched the smoke column build from a thin white thread to a churning pillar in less than an hour, how the retardant planes had come in low enough that he could see the red slurry falling from their bellies. He told me about the elk that sometimes crossed the meadow near his tower at dawn, moving in single file through the wet grass. He asked me how I was handling the quiet, and I said fine, and I think we both knew that was only mostly true. Before we signed off, I asked him if he'd ever heard anything about the trees moving. There was a pause. Radio silence has a particular quality. It's not just the absence of speech, but the presence of static, a low hiss that fills the space and makes you aware of the distance between you and the other person. Davis came back and said he wasn't sure what I meant. I said I'd found a note in the handbook, something a previous lookout had written, and he said that old handbooks were full of strange things. He said someone at a tower in the Gifford-Pinchot district had once filled an entire logbook with drawings of spirals instead of weather data. He said isolation did things to people. He said it in a way that was kind rather than dismissive, and I appreciated that. After we signed off, I stood on the catwalk and looked at the forest in the late twilight. The wind had died to almost nothing, which was unusual. The canopy was still. I could see the meadow to the west, a pale shape in the dimming light, and the tree line along its edge. I looked at it for a while. Then I went inside and wrote in my journal that the tree line seemed the same as when I'd last described it. I wrote that sentence and then stared at it for a moment, wondering why I felt the need to confirm it. The days accumulated. I settled deeper into the routines, and the routines became invisible, which is to say, they became the structure of my life rather than activities I performed within it. I stopped noticing the swaying of the tower. I stopped checking my watch as often. The weather observations became automatic, a series of motions and readings that my hands performed while my mind drifted elsewhere. I could read the psychrometer and calculate the dew point spread without thinking about it. I could estimate wind speed from the motion of the trees before I even looked at the gauge. That was something I hadn't expected, the way you learn to read the forest. After enough hours of watching, you begin to understand its visual language. A gust of 20 miles per hour looks different from a gust of 30. The way individual species respond to wind is distinct. Douglas firs sway from the top, a slow, heavy arc. Hemlocks are more flexible, bending further down the trunk. Cedars barely move at all in moderate wind, but their flat sprays of foliage flutter in a way that creates a shimmering effect across the canopy. After 3 weeks, I could look at a section of forest and tell you the approximate wind speed and direction without any instruments, just from the way the trees were behaving. Which is why, on July 3rd, I noticed something I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon, maybe 14:30. I was doing a routine scan, working the firefinder around from north to east. The sky was clear, visibility excellent, and I was mostly going through the motions, not expecting to see anything. I paused with the sighting ring pointed northeast, toward a section of forest I'd looked at hundreds of times. Dense canopy, no features, no snags, just an unbroken field of dark green extending to the next ridge. The wind was out of the southwest at about 10 miles per hour, steady, and I could see it moving through the trees in the expected pattern, a gentle, rhythmic sway rolling from my left to my right as the wind pushed across the canopy, except in one area. Maybe a quarter mile out, maybe a little more, there was a section of canopy, perhaps an acre, perhaps slightly less, where the trees appeared to be swaying in a different direction. Not against the wind exactly, but at an angle to it, as if the wind in that particular spot was coming from a different quarter. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds. The motion was subtle. If I hadn't spent weeks learning to read the wind in the trees, I probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. But it was there. A patch of forest moving to its own rhythm, slightly out of phase with everything around it. I looked away. I checked the wind gauge. Southwest at 11, gusting to 14. Consistent. I looked back at the area, and it took me a moment to find it again, and when I did, it seemed less pronounced. The difference was still there, I thought, but I was no longer certain. I watched for another minute, and the longer I watched, the harder it became to tell whether the motion was actually different or whether I was simply creating the difference by looking for it. There is a phenomenon in visual perception, I know this from my teaching days, where the act of focused attention can generate apparent patterns that aren't present in the stimulus. You stare at television static long enough, and you start to see shapes. You watch a field of grass in the wind, and you can convince yourself that something is moving through it. I was aware of this, and the awareness made me doubt what I was seeing, and the doubt made me look harder, and looking harder made the doubt worse. I wrote it in the log as a possible thermal anomaly. Localized wind variation, probably caused by differential heating of the terrain. The northeast slope would have been in partial shade by that time of day, and the transition between sunlit and shaded ground can create small convective cells that produce their own air currents. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I wrote it down and moved on. But I kept coming back to that spot during my scans over the next few days. I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to it the way your tongue is drawn to a chipped tooth. Each time I looked, the forest there appeared normal. The canopy moved with the wind, in the right direction, at the right speed. I began to feel faintly embarrassed, as if I'd been caught overreacting to something that was never there. By July 6th, I'd stopped looking specifically at that area and had resumed my normal scanning pattern. On July 8th, I woke before dawn and couldn't get back to sleep. This happened sometimes. The cot was not comfortable, and the wind had been gusty during the night, and the tower's swaying had been more pronounced than usual. I lay in the dark and listened to the forest and thought about nothing in particular, and eventually I got up and made coffee and went out on the catwalk to watch the sunrise. The dawn light in the mountains comes in stages. First the sky lightens, a slow bleaching of the darkness that begins in the east and spreads upward. Then the highest peaks catch the first direct light, turning gold and then white, while the valleys below are still in shadow. Then the light descends, pouring down the slopes, and the forest emerges from the dark in a wave of color that moves from the ridgelines down to the valley floors. It takes maybe 40 minutes from first light to full illumination on a clear day, and during that time, the forest goes through a sequence of appearances that are each distinct and transient. I was watching this process, leaning on the railing with my coffee, when I looked toward the meadow to the west. In the early light, it was a pale gold, the grass catching the low sun and glowing against the dark mass of the surrounding forest. I looked at the tree line along its western edge, the straight line I had noted in my journal weeks before, and I felt something shift in my perception, a subtle dislocation, like when you're reading and you realize you've been looking at the same sentence for a minute without processing it. The tree line was straight. It had always been straight. But it seemed closer to the meadow's center than I remembered. Not by much. By maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 yards. The meadow seemed slightly narrower at that point. I stared at it and tried to remember exactly what it had looked like when I'd first described it. I had written that it was 80 yards wide at its broadest. Was it still 80 yards? It was impossible to judge distance that precisely from the tower, especially in the changing light of early morning. I was looking at it from above and at an angle, and depth perception at that distance is unreliable. I knew this. I went inside and found my journal entry from June 19th, 80 yards wide at its broadest point. I looked out the window at the meadow. I couldn't tell. It might have been 80 yards. It might have been 70. The difference, if there was one, was within the margin of error of a visual estimate from a quarter-mile away. I considered going down to measure it. The thought entered my mind, and I examined it and decided it was unreasonable. It would take an hour to climb down the tower, walk to the meadow, pace off the width, and climb back up. During that time, I would be away from my post and unable to scan for smoke. For what? To confirm that a meadow was the same width it had always been. To prove that my memory of a casual estimate written 3 weeks ago was accurate. The idea was absurd. I was being absurd. I made my 6 o'clock observation. Temperature, 49 degrees. Humidity, 71%. Wind calm. Sky clear. I radioed it in. The day was ordinary. I did my scans, read my book, ate lunch, did more scans. The forest was the forest. I did not look at the meadow any more than was required by the normal rotation of my scanning pattern. That evening, I talked to Davis again on the radio. He told me about a black bear that had been hanging around the base of his tower, attracted by the smell of his cooking. He'd been banging pots together to scare it off, but it kept coming back. We laughed about it. I did not mention the meadow. I did not mention the patch of canopy that had seemed to be moving wrong. I didn't mention these things because there was nothing to mention. Nothing had happened. I had made imprecise observations and then been unsettled by their imprecision. That was all. July passed. The weather grew hotter and drier, and the fire danger increased. I started seeing smoke twice, both times thin white columns rising from the northeast, and both times I called them in with compass bearings and estimates of distance, and both times they turned out to be small fires that the crews reached quickly. The district fire management officer called me on the radio after the second one and said I had a good eye. I felt disproportionately pleased by this. The loneliness had reached the stage where any acknowledgement from another person felt like warmth, like stepping into sunlight after being in shade. The loneliness itself was a thing I was still learning to navigate. It wasn't constant. There were hours, sometimes whole days, where I felt perfectly content with my own company, absorbed in a book or a long observation of the landscape, present in a way that I rarely achieved in the cluttered, interruptive world below. But then there were other hours where the silence pressed in from all sides, and I became acutely aware that there was no one within miles of me, that if I fell on the stairs or cut myself badly while cooking, no one would know until the next morning when I failed to make my weather report. The isolation wasn't just distance. It was the knowledge that the distance was real, that the miles of forest between me and the nearest person were not a metaphor, but a physical fact, filled with terrain that would take days to cross on foot. I started talking to myself, not in a way that concerned me, just small narrations of what I was doing. Okay, checking the wind gauge. All right, time for coffee. Simple things just to hear a voice. I also started talking to the jays that landed on the catwalk. I gave them names, which I know is a cliché of isolation narratives, but I did it anyway because it made the mornings easier. There was a large one with a crooked tail feather that I called Bishop, and a smaller, more cautious one that I called Pearl, and they came most days around 7:30 and sat on the railing and screamed at me until I threw out some crumbs. It was during this period, the middle of July, that I started to have trouble with my logs, not the weather data. That was always precise because it came from instruments. The trouble was with my written observations, the descriptive notes I added to the log about visibility, cloud formations, smoke sightings, anything unusual. I began noticing small discrepancies between what I wrote and what I remembered writing. One morning, I reviewed the previous day's log and found a note about a haze layer to the south that I didn't remember seeing. The handwriting was mine. The observation was detailed and specific. Thin haze layer visible along southern horizon, approximately 5 to 8 miles, possibly smoke from controlled burn in Chelan district. It was plausible. There had been controlled burns in that area, but I had no memory of seeing haze the previous day, and no memory of writing that note. I attributed this to monotony. The days were so similar that they blurred together. It was entirely possible that I had seen haze and written about it, and then, because it was unremarkable, failed to encode it as a distinct memory. This happens to everyone. You drive to work and arrive with no memory of the drive because it was the same as every other drive. The lookout equivalent was logging an observation that was so routine it left no mark. I accepted this explanation and didn't think about it further, but it happened again. On July 17th, I found a note in my log that referenced a wind shift at 15:23. Wind shifted to northwest at 15:23, sustained 15, gusting 22. I remembered that afternoon clearly, or thought I did. I had been reading. The wind had been steady from the southwest all day. I did not remember a shift to the northwest, and a shift that significant would have been notable, would have changed the way the forest looked and sounded and felt. I would have noticed it. I was certain I would have noticed it. I checked the weather data for that day. The instrument readings at 1800. My evening observation showed wind from the southwest at 9 miles per hour. If there had been a significant shift to the northwest at 15:23, It had corrected itself by 1800. That was possible. Wind shifts happen and reverse. But the gap between the written observation and my memory troubled me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't that I thought the note was wrong. The handwriting was mine, the format was correct, the detail was specific enough to suggest direct observation. It was that I had no memory of the experience that should have accompanied the writing of that note, as if someone had extracted a segment of my afternoon and replaced it with a continuation of the hours on either side. I started paying closer attention to my logging. I began adding timestamps more carefully, and when I wrote an observation, I would pause afterward and deliberately commit it to memory. I would say to myself, I am writing this note about cirrus clouds at 1400, and I would try to anchor the moment with sensory details, the warmth of the sun through the glass, the feel of the pen, the specific quality of the light. It was a conscious effort to stitch my experience to the record, and for a while it seemed to work. The logs and my memory aligned. The discrepancies stopped, which should have been reassuring, but instead it made me wonder whether the earlier discrepancies had been real, or whether I had imagined them, and if I had imagined them, what that said about the reliability of my mind in this environment. I thought about the note in the handbook. I thought about what Davis had said. That isolation does things to people. I thought about the lookout who had filled a logbook with spirals. On July 21st, I ran out of the coffee I'd brought and had to open the supply cache in the storage compartment below the cab. The cache had been stocked before my arrival with canned food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, batteries, and several pounds of ground coffee in vacuum-sealed bags. I climbed down to the storage platform and opened the metal box and found everything in order. While I was there, I checked the structural bolts on the tower, which was part of the weekly maintenance I'd been taught. The bolts were fine. The tower was fine. Everything was fine. As I climbed back up, I paused on the stairs at a point where my eye level was just above the canopy. I was facing northeast, toward the area where I had seen the anomalous movement 2 weeks earlier. From this lower angle, the forest looked different. The canopy wasn't a surface anymore, but a mass, a dense tangle of branches and trunks that receded into shadow below the crown layer. I could see maybe 20 or 30 feet into the forest before the darkness became complete. The trees at the edge were large, old growth, their trunks 3 or 4 feet in diameter, spaced irregularly, their lower branches dead and bare, their crowns interlocking overhead. They had a stillness to them at this angle that was different from how they appeared from above. From the cab, the forest was an abstraction, a texture, a map. From here it was a place, a physical space with depth and darkness and the suggestion of interiority. Something could be in there. Many things were in there, deer and bear and cougar and owl, and all the unnamed smaller creatures that lived and fed and died under the canopy. But from here, knowing that intellectually was different from feeling it, the forest had presence. I went back up and made coffee and did my scan, and everything was normal. Late July was the hottest period. The temperatures climbed into the high 90s in the valleys, and even at my elevation, it reached the mid-80s in the afternoons. The fire danger went to extreme. I was told to increase my scanning frequency, and I did, moving from 3 full rotations a day to 5. The extra vigilance was good for me, I think. It gave me more to do, more structure, more purpose, and it meant I was looking at the forest more carefully and more often. which should have been comforting because it meant I had more data to compare, more reference points for what was normal. On July 26th, during my late morning scan, I noticed that the meadow to the west appeared to have changed shape. Not dramatically. The overall form was the same, an elongated oval, but the proportions seemed different. It looked shorter and wider than I remembered. I tried to compare it to my journal description from 5 weeks earlier, but the description wasn't detailed enough to confirm or deny what I was seeing. I had written the length as roughly 300 yards, and it still looked like roughly 300 yards. But rough estimates are useless when you're trying to detect a change of 10 or 20 yards at distance. I thought about this for a while. I sat with the firefinder and took compass bearings on both ends of the meadow and on the widest point of its eastern and western edges. I wrote these bearings down. If the meadow changed, the bearings would change, and that would be objective and measurable and not dependent on my memory or my perception. This felt like a good idea, a rational response to an irrational worry. The bearings were north end, 342 degrees, south end, 351 degrees, east edge at widest point, 345 degrees, west edge at widest point, 348 degrees. I recorded these in my personal journal, not in the official log, because I didn't want anyone at the district office to wonder why the lookout was taking compass bearings on a meadow. I checked those bearings the next day, and they were the same. I checked them the day after that, and they were the same. I checked them 4 days later, and the west edge bearing had shifted by half a degree. 348 had become 347.5. Half a degree. On the firefinder's scale, that was barely more than a hair's width. It was well within the range of measurement error. The firefinder was precise, but not infinitely so, and my ability to read it was limited by the steadiness of my hand and the alignment of my eye. I could have bumped the instrument. I could have read it slightly differently. Half a degree meant nothing, but it meant nothing in the wrong direction. If the west edge of the meadow was now at 347.5 instead of 348, that meant the bearing had shifted slightly to the east, which meant the tree line on the western edge of the meadow was slightly closer to the eastern edge, which meant the meadow was slightly narrower. I am going to describe what I did next because I think it's important for understanding how I was thinking at that time, and because it illustrates the way a small doubt can become a methodology. I made a chart. I drew a diagram of the meadow in my journal with the compass bearings labeled, and I committed to checking them every morning at the same time during my 0600 observation, using the same eye, my right, and the same hand position on the firefinder. I would record the bearings to the nearest half degree and track any changes over time. If the meadow was not changing, the data would show stability, and I could put the matter to rest. If it was changing, the data would show a trend, and I would have evidence. Evidence of what I didn't allow myself to think about. For 5 days the bearings were stable, 342, 351, 345, 347.5. Every morning, the same numbers. I began to relax. The half-degree shift on the west edge had been a measurement error, as expected, and now the numbers were holding steady because there was nothing to change. The meadow was a meadow. The trees were trees. I was a person alone in a tower whose mind was looking for problems because it didn't have enough to occupy it. On the 6th day, August 2nd, I took the bearings and the north end of the meadow had shifted. 342 had become 342.5, half a degree to the east. The south end was unchanged. The east and west edges were unchanged. Just the north end moving half a degree. I took the bearing again. 342.5. I took it a third time, very carefully, closing one eye and aligning the sighting wire with the exact point where the meadow grass ended and the first tree trunk began. 342.5. I sat down. I looked at my chart. The north end had moved east by half a degree. If this was real, it meant the tree line at the north end of the meadow had shifted slightly to the east and south, which meant what? That the meadow was being compressed from the northwest, that the forest was, at its northern boundary, fractionally closer to the meadow's center than it had been a week ago. I stared at the numbers and tried to calculate what half a degree of compass bearing translated to, in terms of actual distance at a range of maybe 400 yards. The math wasn't hard. At 400 yards, half a degree was roughly 3.5 yards. Was I claiming that the tree line had moved 3.5 yards? In a week? Trees don't move 3.5 yards. Trees don't move at all. The root systems of mature Douglas firs are massive and anchored and permanent. A tree is, definitionally, something that stays where it is. I closed the journal. I went outside and walked around the catwalk twice. The air was hot and dry, and the forest below was still, the wind not yet risen from its morning calm. I looked at the meadow. It looked like a meadow. It looked like the same meadow I had been staring at for 6 weeks. I could not see a 3.5-yard change in the tree line from a quarter mile away with my naked eye. The whole exercise was pointless. I was measuring noise and calling it signal. I went back inside and did my scan and didn't take the bearings the next morning, or the morning after that. I left the journal closed and returned to my routines and told myself that I was done with it. On August the 5th, I had a radio exchange that I have thought about many times since. It was late afternoon, and dispatch called with a request to provide a bearing on a possible smoke sighting reported by an aircraft. The pilot had seen what looked like a thin column southwest of my position, and they wanted a ground-level confirmation. I went to the firefinder and sighted along the bearing they gave me, 220 degrees. I looked carefully. The sky in that direction was clear. No smoke, no haze, nothing. I swept 10 degrees on either side and found nothing. I reported negative smoke to dispatch. The dispatcher acknowledged and then said something I didn't understand. He said, "Copy, negative smoke from Baker Ridge." I said, "Say again?" He said, "Negative smoke from Baker Ridge. That's your position, correct?" I said, "This is Desolation Peak Lookout." There was a pause. Then he said, "Right, copy, Desolation. Sorry about that." I didn't think much of it at the time. Dispatchers handle multiple lookouts, and they occasionally mix up call signs. Baker Ridge was another tower in the district, maybe 40 miles south. A simple mistake. But something about it lingered. Not the error itself, but the casualness of it. He had called me Baker Ridge without hesitation, as if that was what his records showed. As if, for a moment, my position in the system had been somewhere else. I looked up Baker Ridge on the map posted on the wall of the cab. It was where I expected it to be, well, to my south, in a different drainage entirely. I found Desolation Peak, my peak, in its correct location. Everything was where it should be. The radio error was just a radio error. I let it go. The next night, I couldn't sleep. This was becoming more common. The heat made the cab stuffy even with the windows cracked, and the absence of wind meant the tower didn't sway, which I had, without realizing it, come to depend on for comfort, the way a child depends on the motion of a rocking cradle. I lay on the cot and listened to the silence, which was not really silence, but the aggregated sound of a million small events in the dark forest below, and I thought about all the things I had been not thinking about. The inconsistent swaying, the meadow bearings, the log entries I didn't remember writing, the dispatch error. Individually, each one was nothing. Each had a simple, reasonable explanation, but together they formed a pattern that I couldn't quite see the shape of, a constellation of small wrongnesses that might be random or might be connected by something I hadn't identified. I got up and turned on the battery lantern, keeping it dim, and opened the handbook to the back cover. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. I read it several times. I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The pencil was faint, as I had observed initially, but looking more closely in the low light, I could see that the letters had been traced more than once. The person hadn't written the sentence and moved on. They had gone back over it, retracing each letter carefully, reinforcing the marks, as if they wanted to make sure it would still be legible after years of handling, as if it was important that the next person be able to read it. I put the handbook away and went back to bed and eventually slept. August continued. The heat held. I spotted one more fire, a small lightning strike on a distant ridge, and called it in. The days were long and dry and identical. I maintained my routines. I did my scans. I read my books. I talked to Davis on the radio every few evenings, and he told me that the bear had finally lost interest in his tower, and I told him that Bishop the Jay had brought what appeared to be a mate, and we talked about small things in the way that people do when the small things are the only things that happen. I did not take compass bearings on the meadow. I did not look specifically at the northeast section where I'd seen the anomalous movement. I did not review old log entries for discrepancies. I performed my job and kept my observations routine, and did not investigate anything that was not directly related to fire detection. This was a deliberate choice, and I was aware of it as a deliberate choice, and I was aware that the need to make it deliberately meant something, but I chose not to examine what it meant. On August 14th, I broke. That's too dramatic a word. Nothing broke. What happened was that I was doing my late afternoon scan, and my eye passed over the northeast section, and I saw it again. The canopy was moving wrong. The wind was out of the west at 12 miles per hour, steady, and the trees across the visible landscape were responding uniformly, a gentle east-flowing wave across the treetops. But in that same area, maybe a quarter mile out, the canopy was moving differently. This time, I couldn't rationalize it as a thermal anomaly, because the motion wasn't random or circular, which is what convective turbulence would produce. The motion was directional. The trees in that patch were swaying from east to west against the prevailing wind. They were moving toward me. I watched for a long time. I don't know how long. The firefinder was pointed northeast, and my eye was at the sighting ring, and I watched the patch of canopy move in its wrong direction, while the forest around it moved in the right one. It was like watching a current in a river, a visible stream of contrary motion embedded in the larger flow. And the longer I watched, the more certain I became that it was real, and the more certain I became, the more I wanted to stop watching. I stepped back from the firefinder, I went to the window and looked with my naked eye, and from there, without magnification, I couldn't see it. The forest looked uniform. The canopy moved with the wind. I went back to the fire finder and sighted northeast, and there it was. The contrary motion, unmistakable. I picked up the radio. I don't know what I intended to say. I keyed the mic and then released it without speaking. What would I report? That a patch of trees was moving in the wrong direction? That the forest was doing something impossible? Dispatch would think I was having a breakdown. They would send someone to check on me, and by the time they arrived, the motion would have stopped, or I would be unable to find it, or it would look like ordinary wind variation to anyone who hadn't spent weeks learning the specific visual signature of this particular forest. I would have no evidence. I would have nothing but my own perception, and my perception was exactly what I was no longer sure I could trust. I set the radio down. I looked through the fire finder one more time. The contrary motion was still there, but it seemed, possibly, to be closer than before. Not by much. But the patch of wrong-moving canopy seemed to extend slightly farther toward the tower than it had 5 minutes ago. I stepped back and closed my eyes and stood in the middle of the cab with my eyes closed and my hands at my sides, and breathed. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. I kept them closed for what felt like a long time, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. The tower swayed gently in the wind, and I could hear the forest making its usual sound, the layered rushing of the canopy, indistinguishable from any other afternoon. When I opened my eyes, I went immediately to the fire finder and sighted northeast. The canopy was moving with the wind. Uniform, normal, the contrary motion was gone. I sat down heavily in the chair and looked at my hands and discovered that they were trembling slightly. I made fists and then released them and watched the trembling subside. Then I made my 1800 observation, which was late by 11 minutes, and radioed it in, and the dispatcher acknowledged without comment. In my journal that night, I wrote a single line. It happened. Then I stared at it and crossed it out and wrote instead, possible visual anomaly at approximately 1640, northeast sector, resolved after brief interruption of observation. Then I crossed that out too because it sounded clinical in a way that felt dishonest, and wrote nothing at all. The next few days were quiet, and the quiet felt different. Previously, the quiet of the forest had been neutral, a condition of the environment, something I was in. Now it felt provisional. The forest was quiet because nothing was happening, but the nothing was active, a deliberate absence, a pause. I was aware, in a way I hadn't been before, that the quiet could end, that it would end, that the only question was when and whether I would be looking when it did. I resumed taking compass bearings on the meadow. I don't know why. Some part of me needed the numbers, needed the structure of data, needed something I could write down and point to and say, this is what I measured, this is what changed, this is not my imagination. The bearings had not changed since my last measurement on August 2nd. 342.5, 351, 345, 347.5. Stable. I took them every morning for the next week, and they were the same every time. On August 20th, I noticed something about the meadow that had nothing to do with the bearings. The grass was dying. This was expected. It was late August in a drought year, and meadow grasses dry out and turn brown as summer progresses. But the pattern of the dying was unusual. The brown was spreading from the edges inward, from the tree line toward the center, as if the meadow were shrinking, as if the forest were claiming it from the outside in. The green grass in the center was a smaller and smaller island each day, retreating from the advancing brown ring that surrounded it. I know this is how grass dies. I know that the edges of a meadow, where the trees shade the ground and the root systems compete for water, dry out faster than the center. But knowing this and watching it happen slowly, day by day, while also holding in my mind the question of whether the tree line itself was advancing, these two pieces of information sat next to each other in my thoughts and produced a feeling that I can only describe as geometric unease. Everything was converging inward. The meadow's green center was shrinking. The tree line might be closing in. The anomalous motion in the northeast had been moving toward the tower. All the vectors pointed inward, toward the center, toward me. I recognized this thought pattern as potentially paranoid and tried to set it aside. I reminded myself that I was the center of every vector, because I was the observer, and all observations radiate outward from the observer's position. Of course, everything seemed to converge on me. That was a function of perspective, not of reality. The meadow was not closing in. The forest was not advancing. I was a tired person in a tower in the heat of August, and I was making patterns from noise. On August 22nd, Davis didn't come on the radio for our usual evening conversation. I called him on the mutual aid frequency at our usual time and got no response. I tried again an hour later. Nothing. I tried on the main dispatch frequency and asked if anyone had heard from the Baker Ridge lookout, and the dispatcher said that Baker Ridge was offline for scheduled maintenance and would be back up in a few days. I asked about Davis specifically, and the dispatcher said he didn't have that information and suggested I try again later. This was the moment I realized the dispatcher had said Baker Ridge. Davis was not at Baker Ridge. Davis was at a different tower, one whose name I couldn't remember just then. But I knew it wasn't Baker Ridge because Baker Ridge was 40 miles to my south, and Davis had described his tower as being to my southeast. And the distances he'd described for various landmarks didn't match the Baker Ridge location. I was almost certain of this, but I couldn't remember the name of Davis's tower, and I couldn't remember whether he had ever actually said the name of his tower. And as I sat there trying to recall, I realized that I also couldn't remember Davis's first name, or whether Davis was his first name, or his last name, or whether he had ever told me. I had been talking to this man for weeks. We had shared stories and jokes and the small, intimate details of daily life that people exchange when they are both lonely and far apart, and I could not remember basic facts about him, his tower, his name, where exactly he was. I could remember the content of our conversations, but not the identifying information that would place him in the real world. He existed in my memory as a voice and a collection of anecdotes, disconnected from geography. This bothered me more than anything else that had happened, more than the meadow bearings or the log discrepancies or the moving trees. Those were external phenomena that might or might not be real. This was a failure of my own mind, a gap in the architecture of my memory that I couldn't explain and couldn't fill. I turned on the radio and called on the mutual aid frequency. "This is Desolation Peak Lookout. Any station, please confirm the name and location of the lookout southeast of Desolation Peak." I waited. Static, the low hiss of the channel. Then a voice I didn't recognize said, "Desolation, this is dispatch. Say again your request." I repeated it. There was a pause, and then the voice said, "Desolation. We show no staffed lookout to your southeast. The nearest active tower southeast of your position is Baker Ridge." Then silence. I sat with the radio in my hand and looked out the window toward the southeast, where the forest stretched away in undifferentiated green to the ridgeline. I had been talking to someone for weeks. I had heard his voice. He had told me about a bear and an elk herd and a fire he'd spotted the previous summer. He had been real, but the district had no record of a lookout in the direction I'd indicated, and the only tower they could suggest was one whose name had already appeared in my story in ways that felt wrong. I put the radio down. I went out on the catwalk and looked at the forest and tried to feel the solidity of the railing under my hands and the boards under my feet and the wind on my face. Real things, tangible things. I watched the last light fade and the forest darken and the stars emerge, and I told myself that there was an explanation for all of this that did not require the world to be other than what it appeared. But I no longer quite believed myself. The final week of August. The heat broke on the 24th, a cold front moving in from the Pacific, dropping the temperature 20 degrees overnight, and bringing high clouds and a dampness in the air that I had almost forgotten existed. The fire danger eased. My scanning frequency returned to normal. The rhythms of the job reasserted themselves, and I settled into them with a gratitude that had a desperate quality to it. I wanted the routine. I needed the routine. The routine was the structure that kept me from following my thoughts to places they shouldn't go. I took my meadow bearings every morning. They were stable. 342.5, 351, 345, 347.5. The same numbers every day. I took them and recorded them and felt a small relief each time and didn't think about what it would mean if they changed again. On August 27th, I found something in my official log that I hadn't written. Not a weather observation or a fire report, but a single line at the bottom of the day's page, in handwriting that was similar to mine, but not identical. The letters were slightly more compressed, the slant slightly different. It said, "Wind steady all day. No anomalies observed." I stared at it for a long time. Then I went back through the logbook, page by page, looking for other entries that weren't mine. I found 3. All were brief, 1 or 2 lines, all in the same compressed handwriting. They were all innocuous observations, notes about weather or visibility, the kinds of things I wrote every day. But I hadn't written them. I was sure of it, fairly sure. The problem was that the handwriting was close enough to mine that I couldn't be absolutely certain it wasn't mine in a moment of distraction. My pen held at a slightly different angle, my hand tired, my attention elsewhere. I put the logbook down and walked to the window and looked out at the forest. The cloud cover was low, obscuring the higher ridges, and the trees below had a muted quality in the gray light, darker and less distinct than on clear days. The meadow was a dull brown now, the last of the green finally gone. The tree line around it was a hard, dark edge against the dead grass. I picked up the fire finder and took the meadow bearings. North end, 343. I stopped, looked again. 343, not 342.5. I took it again. 343. The north end had moved another half degree to the east. I took the remaining bearings. South end, 351. East edge, 345, west edge 347, not 47.5, 47. The west edge had also shifted half a degree to the east. Both edges were closing in. The meadow was narrower by half a degree on each side, which translated to maybe 7 yards total, maybe 3.5 on each side. I sat down and looked at my chart and added the new numbers. The trend was unmistakable now, not large, not dramatic, but consistent. The tree line was closing in on the meadow, slowly, incrementally, at a rate that could only be detected by careful measurement over weeks. If I hadn't been tracking it, I never would have noticed. The change was too small to see. But the trees can't move. I wrote that in my journal. The trees can't move. I looked at the sentence and thought about what else I had written and crossed out, and I left it there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the fire finder in the dark and looked out at the forest, which was invisible except as a darker darkness below the cloud-covered sky. No stars, no moon, just the blackness of the canopy and the faint gray of the overcast above it. The wind was light but steady, and the tower swayed, and the forest made its sound. And I sat and listened and watched and waited for something I couldn't name. At some point during the night, I became aware that the sound of the forest had changed. The change was subtle, a gradual shift in the character of the rushing that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been listening so intently. The sound of wind in trees is produced by the movement of leaves and branches. It has a frequency and a texture that depends on the species of tree, the wind speed, and the distance. What I was hearing now sounded closer, not louder exactly, but more present, more detailed, as if the trees that were producing the sound were nearer to the tower than they had been before. I could hear individual branches in the mix, specific creaks and scrapes and rustles that I would normally only hear from the closest trees, the ones right at the edge of the ridge below the tower. But these sounds seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest had drawn closer in a ring while I sat in the dark. I did not look out the window. I sat in the chair and listened and did not look. The instruction in the handbook said to close my eyes if the trees started moving, but my eyes were useless in the dark anyway. What I needed to close were my ears, and I couldn't do that. The sounds continued until just before dawn. As the sky began to lighten, they receded like a tide going out, the detailed individual sounds fading back into the general wash of the canopy, the sense of proximity dissolving into the ordinary acoustics of distance. When the light was strong enough to see, I went to the window and looked. The forest was where it had been. The tree line was at its usual distance. The meadow was there, brown and still. Everything was normal. I took the compass bearings. They were the same as the day before. 343, 351, 345, 347. No change from the night before. Whatever I had heard, it had left no measurable evidence. I made my 0600 observation and radioed it in. The dispatcher acknowledged. I asked, on impulse, for a radio check with all active lookout towers in the district. The dispatcher said he'd pass along the request. Over the next half hour, 3 towers checked in. None of them were Davis. None of them were at a location southeast of me. I acknowledged each one and thanked dispatch and turned the radio off. September arrived, and with it the knowledge that my time on the tower was ending. My contract ran through September 7th, a week. 7 more days of observations and scans, and the long hours of watching, and the longer hours of not watching. I should have felt relief. I think I was supposed to feel relief. What I felt instead was something like the opposite, a deepening reluctance to leave that was tangled up with a deepening desire to go. Both feelings were strong and genuine and contradictory, and I sat with them and didn't try to resolve them. The weather turned cooler. Morning temperatures dropped into the 30s, and the first frost appeared on the catwalk railing, a thin white rime that melted by mid-morning. The fire danger dropped to moderate, then to low. The forest began to change color, just barely, the first faint yellowing of the larches on the high slopes, a shift so gradual that I couldn't say when it began, only that it was now undeniably present. I continued my routines. I took my bearings. The numbers held. I did my scans and saw no smoke. I wrote my logs and checked them carefully and found no entries I didn't remember writing. The days were calm and clear and quiet, and the forest behaved like a forest, and I began to wonder, genuinely and with something approaching hope, whether the strangeness of August had been nothing more than a combination of heat, isolation, and an overactive mind, whether I had simply spent too long alone, watching too carefully, finding meaning in randomness and pattern in noise, whether the whole thing was, in the end, just me. On September 4th, 3 days before my departure, I woke at dawn and made coffee, and went out on the catwalk and looked at the meadow, and knew immediately that something was wrong. The meadow was smaller, not by the fractional amounts I had been tracking with the compass bearings, smaller in a way that was visible to the naked eye. The tree line on the western edge was significantly closer to the center than it had been the day before. Not 3.5 yards, 20 or 30 yards at least. The meadow, which had been roughly 80 yards wide when I arrived, was now perhaps 40. The trees along its edges were dense and straight and close together, and they looked the same as the trees that had always been there. The same species, the same height, the same age. There were no young trees, no saplings, no sign of recent growth. The trees at the new edge of the meadow looked as if they had stood in that spot for 100 years. I went to the fire finder. My hands were steady. I took the bearings. North end, 345. South end, 349. East edge, 346. West edge, 346.5. The numbers bore no resemblance to what I had been tracking. The meadow had collapsed in on itself by several degrees of arc in every direction. The tree line had advanced by dozens of yards. Not overnight. It couldn't have happened overnight. Trees don't move. Trees don't move. But the numbers were in front of me, and the meadow was in front of me, and both were telling me the same thing. I looked at my chart, my weeks of data, the gradual half-degree shifts, the careful measurements, and I realized that the data didn't support what I was seeing. The data showed a slow, almost imperceptible closing. What I was looking at was something else entirely. The meadow had not gradually shrunk. It had jumped. Something had changed between yesterday and today that my incremental measurements could not account for, unless the incremental measurements were wrong, unless the numbers I had been recording were not the numbers I had actually measured, unless my logs, like the weather observations I didn't remember writing, contained information that had been placed there without my awareness. I thought about the entries in the compressed handwriting. I thought about the wind shift I didn't remember. I thought about Davis, who no one else could confirm existed. and I thought about how thoroughly, how completely, my record of events might diverge from the events themselves, and how I would have no way to know. I put the firefinder's sighting ring on the northeast sector. I looked. The forest was moving, not the wind-driven sway that I had spent months learning to read, not the gentle rhythmic wave of canopy responding to air currents. The trees were moving. The entire visible forest in the northeast sector was in motion, a slow, deliberate, unified drift that looked less like wind and more like migration. The canopy was shifting from right to left, from east to west, toward the tower. I could see individual tree crowns changing position relative to their neighbors, sliding past each other like objects on a conveyor belt. The motion was smooth and continuous and completely silent. There was no sound of roots tearing or trunks scraping or soil breaking. The trees were simply moving through the space they occupied, as if the ground were not a factor. I stepped back from the firefinder. I looked with my naked eyes. With my naked eyes I could see it too. The canopy was moving. The entire northeast quarter of the visible forest was flowing toward me like a slow green tide. I should have been afraid. I think later I would understand that I was afraid, that the fear was present and enormous, but operating below the threshold of my conscious awareness, in the same deep architecture where the body decides to breathe and the heart decides to beat. In the moment, what I felt was clarity, a terrible, absolute clarity, the kind that comes when a thing you have been doubting is confirmed, and the doubt itself is removed, and you are left with only the thing. I looked south. The forest was moving there too, but more slowly, or from a greater distance, so the motion was less pronounced. I looked west. The meadow, what remained of it, was being consumed in real time. The tree line on every edge was advancing inward, the trees walking across the dead grass in their silent, rooted procession, closing the gap, filling the space. As I watched, the meadow shrank by another 10 yards on its western edge. The trees simply arrived where they hadn't been. Old trees, full-grown trees, as if they had always been there, and my memory of open space was the anomaly. I looked at all of it, and I understood something that I had been approaching for weeks without recognizing it. The instruction in the handbook was not about safety. It was not a warning to protect me from the forest. It was a warning to protect me from the knowledge of what the forest was doing. Because as long as I didn't see it, the contradiction didn't exist. The forest could move without my knowing, and my ignorance would preserve the coherent world in which trees stay where they are. The instruction was not close your eyes so you'll be safe. It was close your eyes so you won't have to know. And knowing was the problem, because now that I could see it, now that the motion was confirmed and undeniable and visible to my naked eye, I could not unlearn what it meant. The forest had been moving the entire time, since before I arrived, since before the person who wrote the note in the handbook arrived. The trees moved, and they had always moved, and every lookout who had sat in this tower and stared at this forest had eventually noticed, and the only question was what you did when you finally saw it. I closed my eyes. I stood in the middle of the cab with my eyes closed, and I listened to the silence of the moving forest, and I breathed. I kept them closed for a long time. I don't know how long. The tower swayed in the wind. The firefinder's brass gleamed in the sun that came through the glass. My coffee grew cold on the desk. I stood there and kept my eyes closed and did not look. When I opened them, the forest was still. The canopy was motionless except for the ordinary wind, a light breeze from the west that produced the usual gentle sway in the treetops. The meadow was there, brown and oblong, visible through the western window. The tree lines were sharp and dark and stationary. Everything looked the way it had looked for months, normal, ordinary. A forest in early September, cooling toward autumn. I went to the fire finder and took the meadow bearings. North end, 342. South end, 351. East edge, 345. West edge, 348. The original numbers. The first numbers I had ever recorded. The meadow was back to its full width, 80 yards. The tree line was where it had been in June. I looked at my journal. I turned to the page where I had recorded the morning's alarming bearings, the 345 and 349 and the rest. The numbers that proved the meadow had shrunk. The page was blank, not erased, not crossed out, blank. I flipped back through the journal, looking for my chart, my weeks of data, the careful tracking of half-degree shifts. The pages were there, but the writing on them was different. My charts were gone. My bearings were gone. In their place were ordinary journal entries, descriptions of sunsets and weather and birds. The kind of thing I had also been writing, but that now seemed to be the only thing I had written, as if the measurements had never happened. I checked the official log. The compressed handwriting entries were gone. Every entry was in my hand. The log was clean and consistent and unremarkable. I sat down and held the logbook in my lap and looked at it and understood that the record had changed, or that the record had always been this way, and my memory of a different record was false, and that I had no way to determine which of these was true. The forest was where it had always been. My logs said what they had always said. The handbook still had its note on the back cover, faint and carefully traced, but everything else in my experience of the past 2 months was now open to question. Had the trees moved? My memory said yes. My record said nothing had happened. Had Davis existed? My memory said yes. The district had no record. Had I spent weeks taking compass bearings on a meadow? My memory said yes. My journal said I had been writing about birds. I sat with this for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the cab in its familiar arc. The shadows of the window frames turned on the floor. The forest was quiet and green and still. I made my 1800 observation and radioed it in, and the dispatcher acknowledged, and everything was normal. That night I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and tried to hold both versions of my experience in my mind simultaneously. The version where nothing unusual had happened, and the version where the forest moved. They couldn't coexist. One had to be true and the other false, or they were both true in some way I couldn't comprehend. Or they were both false, and the actual truth was something I hadn't considered. I turned these possibilities over and over, and none of them resolved, and eventually I fell asleep, and I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. The remaining 3 days passed without incident. I did my job. I took my observations. I scanned for smoke and found none. The forest was a forest. The meadow was a meadow. The tower was a tower. On September 7th, Carla drove up the ridge in the same truck and found me packed and waiting on the catwalk with my duffel and my books and the logbook and the handbook. She asked me how the season had been, and I said fine. She asked if I had had any problems, and I said no. She took the logbook and flipped through it and seemed satisfied. She took the handbook and put it in the glove compartment of the truck, and I almost said something about the note on the back cover. And then I didn't, because what would I say? And what would it change? We drove down the ridge in the late morning light, and I watched the forest pass on either side of the road, and the trees were tall and still and permanent in the way that trees are. And I thought about how strange it was that something so large and so solid could also be so uncertain, could be both there and not there, depending on whether you were willing to look. Carla didn't talk much. We passed the meadow where the burnout had been, the charred trunks still standing in the new growth. I watched them pass and tried to remember whether they had been there on the drive in, and I thought they had, but I wasn't sure, and the not sureness had a different quality now than it had in June. In June, not being sure was the natural condition of a memory that hadn't thought to pay attention. Now, not being sure felt like a permanent state, a way of being, the only honest relationship to a world that might at any moment be other than it appears. We reached the district office in Winthrop in the early afternoon. I turned in my gear and signed the end-of-season paperwork and shook hands with the district ranger and walked to my car in the parking lot. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the mountains to the west, where the forest climbed the slopes in a dark, unbroken mass, and I thought about the tower and the view and the glass room above the trees where I had spent 12 weeks watching. Then I started the car and drove away, and I did not look in the rear-view mirror, because I had learned in the end that there are things it is better not to confirm. The seeing is what changes you, not what you see, but the act of seeing it, the moment when perception and reality fail to agree, and you are forced to choose between your eyes and your sanity. The note in the handbook understood this. Whoever wrote it had been where I was. They had stood in the cab and watched the forest do something that forests don't do, and they had learned the same lesson I learned. Close your eyes. Not because the danger is in the forest, but because the danger is in knowing, in carrying the knowledge that the world is not fixed, that the ground you stand on moves when you're not watching, that the only thing keeping it still is your willingness not to look. Close your eyes and let it pass, and when you open them, everything will be where it should be, and you will almost believe it. Almost. I drive back to Bellingham. I unpack my things. I return to the life that I left, which is smaller and quieter than I remembered. I teach my classes. I grade my papers. I go to the grocery store and the coffee shop and the park by the bay where the gulls wheel and cry. I do ordinary things in ordinary places, and the world is stable and predictable and fixed. But sometimes in the evenings, when the light is going and the wind picks up and the trees along the street begin to sway, I notice something in the corner of my vision, a movement that doesn't match the wind, a tree that seems, for just a moment, to be slightly closer than it was the last time I looked, a gap in the canopy that wasn't there yesterday, and I feel the old uncertainty rise in me like a tide, and I close my eyes, and I breathe, and I wait, and when I open them, everything is where it should be. Everything is always where it should be.